My mother-in-law told everyone my miscarriage was God's punishment for marrying her son. I showed the whole family what kind of Christian she really is. The hospital bracelet was still on my wrist when Judith said it at the family dinner. I'd been home for 3 days after losing the baby at 14 weeks, still bleeding, still cramping, still seeing the ultrasound image every time I closed my eyes. My husband Daniel had begged me not to come to his parents' house for Sunday lunch, but I'd insisted because missing it would just make things worse. Judith had this way of turning absence into evidence of moral failure. I should have listened to Daniel. We were halfway through the pot roast when Judith's sister asked how I was feeling, her voice careful and kind. Before I could answer, Judith set down her fork with that precise click that always preceded her pronouncements. Well, Margaret, these things happen when people rush into marriage without proper spiritual preparation. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but he does send messages. The table went silent except for Daniel's sharp intake of breath. Judith continued, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. I'm not saying it's definitely punishment, but when you marry outside your faith tradition and refuse to honor your husband's family values, you can't be surprised when God withdraws his blessings. My hands were shaking so badly I had to put down my water glass. Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor, but his father Raymond put a hand on his arm and told him to sit back down. Judith hadn't finished. She turned to me with that smile she'd perfected, the one that looked benevolent to anyone who didn't know better. I've been praying for your soul, dear. Maybe this is the wake-up call you needed to accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior instead of clinging to your humanist nonsense. I'd been raised Methodist, attended church every Sunday until college, but because I didn't attend Judith's specific evangelical congregation or quote scripture in casual conversation, she'd decided I was a godless heathen corrupting her son. Daniel finally found his voice and told his mother that was the cruelest thing he'd ever heard her say. Judith pressed her hand to her chest like he'd struck her, tears immediately springing to her eyes. I'm only trying to help. I love you both so much, and I can't stand by and watch you walk further from God's path. Raymond backed her up, saying Judith was just concerned about our spiritual welfare, and we were being too sensitive. Daniel's sister Rebecca stared at her plate, saying nothing. His brother Noah actually nodded in agreement with their mother, adding that maybe I should consider attending their church if I wanted God's protection in the future. I stood up from the table, my legs barely holding me, and walked out of that house with whatever dignity I had left. Daniel followed 5 minutes later after what I could only imagine was a screaming match based on the way he slammed the car door. He apologized for his family the entire drive home, but I was somewhere beyond words. The woman had just told me my dead baby was divine retribution, and half her family had agreed with her. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Daniel paced our bedroom, his phone lighting up every few minutes with texts from his family. His mother was apparently heartbroken that I'd left dinner early and confused about why Daniel was so angry. She'd sent him 3 paragraphs about respecting your parents and honoring thy father and mother. His sister finally sent a separate text saying she thought what Judith said was horrible, but she couldn't speak up because she still had to live in this family. At least one person had a conscience, even if it was a cowardly one. The next morning, I woke up to find that Judith had posted on Facebook about the importance of accepting God's will even in times of sorrow. She'd tagged me in it. 37 members of Daniel's extended family and their church community had liked and commented with supportive messages about trusting in the Lord's plan. Daniel reported the post, but Facebook said it didn't violate their community standards. I spent the day blocking relatives I'd met maybe twice at family weddings. The week after the dinner from hell, I got a call from Daniel's grandmother Eileen asking if I'd meet her for coffee. She was the only member of his family I actually liked, a sharp-witted woman in her 80s who seemed to find her daughter-in-law Judith exhausting. I agreed, mostly because I needed to talk to someone who understood how that family operated from the inside. Eileen ordered us both coffee and then pulled out a folder she'd been carrying in her purse. Inside were printouts of Facebook posts, emails, and text messages, all from Judith over the past 2 years, all concerning me. I'd known Judith didn't like me, but seeing it documented like this was different. She started the campaign the week Daniel told her he was going to propose, Eileen said, pushing the papers toward me. I've been keeping track because I've seen her do this before. The messages were vicious. Judith had told her prayer circle that I was leading Daniel away from God. She'd emailed her sisters saying I was probably incapable of being a good mother because I had a career. She'd texted Daniel's siblings regularly with concerns about my worldly influence and suggested they stage an intervention before the wedding. In one particularly detailed email to her pastor, she'd asked if there was any way to prevent the marriage on religious grounds, since I wasn't a member of their church. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small. I couldn't get enough air. Eileen reached across the table and took my hand. I'm showing you this because what she said at dinner wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was calculated. She's been waiting for something bad to happen to you so she could use it as proof that you're wrong for Daniel. When you lost the baby, she saw her opportunity. I asked why Eileen hadn't shown me any of this before, and her face tightened with something like shame. Because I'm a coward. I didn't want to start a family war. But what she said to you crossed a line I can't ignore anymore. You need to know what you're dealing with so you can protect yourself. The rest of our conversation was Eileen explaining the family dynamics I'd only partially understood. Judith had been the queen of her social circle for 30 years, ruling through a combination of religious authority and strategic emotional manipulation. Raymond enabled her because it was easier than confronting her, and their children had learned early that disagreeing with mother meant social exile and constant guilt trips about dishonoring your parents. Rebecca had tried to stand up to Judith once when she was 17 and wanted to go to an out-of-state college. Judith had cried for 3 days straight, took to her bed claiming chest pains, and told everyone at church that her daughter was abandoning the family. Rebecca ended up at the local Christian college and still lived 20 minutes from her parents at age 35. Noah had never even tried to rebel. He'd married a woman Judith approved of, worked at the family business, and attended the same church where Judith taught Sunday school. Daniel was the rebel, the one who'd moved 3 hours away for his job, married someone outside the approved circle, and set boundaries that drove Judith insane with frustrated control. I was the symbol of everything she couldn't control about her son, and she'd been methodically trying to destroy our marriage from day one. Eileen finished her coffee and told me she had more to show me, but not here. Could I come to her house on Thursday morning? She'd be alone, and there were things I needed to see that she couldn't risk copying or removing from her home. I agreed, my mind already racing with what else could possibly be in her documentation. That Thursday, I drove to Eileen's small house on the outskirts of town, the one she'd lived in for 50 years and refused to leave despite Judith's constant pressure to move into a senior community closer to family supervision. Eileen let me in and led me straight to her study, a small room lined with bookshelves and a desk covered in organized stacks of paper. She locked the door behind us. "What I'm about to show you needs to stay between us until you decide how to handle it," Eileen said, pulling out a banker's box from her closet. "Judith doesn't know I have any of this. She thinks I'm a doddering old woman who can't work a computer. She forgets I taught database management before I retired." Inside the box was a laptop, several external hard drives, and folders organized by year going back 15 years. Eileen opened the laptop and logged in, then pulled up a folder structure that was meticulous in its organization. Judith has been running a prayer chain through her church for 20 years. It's supposed to be for people requesting prayers for various needs, medical issues, financial troubles, family problems, but Judith uses it as an intelligence network and a weapon. She opened a subfolder labeled with my name. Inside were hundreds of emails, all CC'd to a distribution list of about 50 email addresses. The earliest one was dated 3 days after Daniel told his family he'd met someone he was serious about. "Prayer request?" The email began. "My son has become involved with a woman who does not share our faith values. Please pray that God opens his eyes to the spiritual danger before it's too late." The emails continued, chronologically documenting Judith's campaign against me. When Daniel proposed, she sent an urgent prayer request about her son being deceived by worldly temptation. When we got engaged, she asked the prayer chain to pray for the engagement to be broken before the wedding. She'd sent detailed prayer requests about my job, my friends, my family, my clothing choices, everything she could frame as evidence of my unsuitability. After our wedding, the prayer requests shifted to praying for Daniel's protection from my influence and for me to either be saved or removed from his life. The most recent email, sent 4 days after my miscarriage, asked the prayer chain to pray that this tragedy would bring me to genuine faith and submission to God's will. 50 people had responded with promises to pray and comments about God's mysterious ways. I felt sick reading through message after message, seeing my private life dissected and weaponized by someone who smiled to my face and signed her Christmas cards with love and prayers. But Eileen wasn't done. She opened another folder, this one labeled Financial. "Judith and Raymond have been telling the family for 3 years that they're struggling financially," Eileen explained. "They've borrowed money from Noah, gotten a loan from Rebecca, and constantly talk about how the business is barely staying afloat. Raymond even asked Daniel for $15,000 last year to cover emergency medical bills. Daniel had given them the money without question, taking it from our savings account despite my concerns. His father had always been there for him growing up, and Daniel felt obligated to help." Eileen pulled up bank statements she'd obtained through her power of attorney over some of Raymond's accounts. They have over $400,000 in savings. The business is profitable. Raymond's medical bills were completely covered by insurance. They've been taking money from their children while sitting on a substantial nest egg. I asked why they would do that, and Eileen's laugh was bitter. "Control. As long as their children owe them money or think they need to help their struggling parents, Judith maintains leverage. She can call in favors, make them feel guilty, keep them financially and emotionally dependent." There was more. Eileen showed me documentation of Judith's volunteer work at a women's shelter through her church, which she talked about constantly as evidence of her Christian charity. But Eileen had phone records showing that Judith had called CPS on 3 different women from the shelter, reporting them for child neglect with fabricated details because they'd refused to attend her Bible study group. All 3 investigations had found no evidence of abuse, but the women had been traumatized by having their children temporarily removed while the allegations were investigated. One woman had been deported during the investigation because the CPS involvement had flagged her immigration status. "Judith sees herself as a warrior for God," Eileen said quietly, Anyone who doesn't submit to her version of Christianity is an enemy to be defeated. She's hurt so many people over the years, always hiding behind religion and charity. I've documented it all because I kept thinking someday someone would need this evidence to stop her. I asked Eileen why she'd never confronted Judith herself, and the old woman's face crumpled. Because she's my daughter-in-law and I love my son. Raymond is a good man who's been beaten down by 30 years of her manipulation. Confronting her would mean destroying my relationship with him, and I'm 83 years old. I don't have many years left with my son. The weight of what Eileen was showing me felt crushing. This wasn't just a difficult mother-in-law who said hurtful things. This was a systematic pattern of abuse disguised as religious devotion, and she'd just used my dead baby as ammunition in her campaign to destroy my marriage. I asked Eileen what she thought I should do with this information, and she closed the laptop carefully. That's not for me to decide, but I'm giving you the tools to protect yourself and your marriage. Daniel needs to see who his mother really is, not the persona she's performed for him his whole life. And maybe, if you're strong enough, you can finally stop her from hurting anyone else. I left Eileen's house with copies of everything on a USB drive, my hands shaking as I drove home. Daniel was at work, wouldn't be home for hours. I sat in our living room with my laptop, going through every file Eileen had given me, and I felt something shift inside me. The grief over my miscarriage was still there, raw and horrible, but now it was joined by a cold anger that felt clarifying. Judith had tried to use my pain to break me. Instead, she'd just given me a reason to fight back. That night, Daniel came home to find me at the kitchen table surrounded by printed emails and bank statements. He asked what I was doing, and I told him to sit down. For the next 2 hours, I walked him through everything Eileen had shown me. Every prayer request disparaging me, every lie about their finances, every manipulation Judith had used to control her children and hurt people outside her immediate family. Daniel's face went through so many emotions I couldn't track them all. Denial, anger, defensiveness, heartbreak, rage. He kept saying there had to be an explanation, that his mother wouldn't do these things, that Eileen must have misunderstood or taken things out of context. So I showed him the emails where Judith explicitly asked her prayer chain to pray for our engagement to be broken. I showed him the bank statements proving his parents had lied about needing money. I showed him the documentation of the women whose lives Judith had destroyed through false CPS reports. By the time I finished, Daniel was crying in a way I'd never seen before. The kind of crying that comes from watching your entire understanding of reality collapse. She used your miscarriage, he said finally, his voice hoarse. She actually used our baby's death to score points in her religious crusade. I reached across the table and took his hand. She's been using everything about our relationship from the beginning. The question is, what do we do about it? Daniel spent that night going through everything himself, reading every email, checking every date against his memories. I watched him piece together a lifetime of manipulation, seeing how many family decisions had been influenced by Judith's strategic emotional warfare. His choice to attend a Christian college instead of the state university he'd wanted. His father's career change that had moved the family closer to Judith's parents. Rebecca's broken engagement to a man Judith didn't approve of. Noah's entire life structured around pleasing their mother. All of it orchestrated through guilt, religious obligation, and calculated emotional manipulation. Around 2 a.m., Daniel looked up from the laptop with red, swollen eyes. We have to tell Rebecca and Noah. They need to know what she's been doing. I agreed, but warned him they might not believe us. They'd been living under Judith's control their entire lives. Breaking free would mean confronting everything they'd accepted as normal. Daniel didn't care. He was done protecting his mother's image at the expense of truth. The next morning, Daniel called Rebecca and asked her to meet us for lunch without telling their parents. She agreed, sounding nervous. When she arrived at the restaurant, Daniel didn't waste time. He pulled out his laptop and showed her the emails Judith had sent about her, including the prayer requests about Rebecca being too independent and needing to submit to parental guidance. The messages about Rebecca's broken engagement were particularly brutal. Judith had told her prayer chain that Rebecca's fiancé was leading her astray and had explicitly asked them to pray for the relationship to end. 2 weeks later, Judith had shown Rebecca's fiancé a series of text messages that appeared to be from Rebecca expressing doubts about marriage. Rebecca had never sent those texts. Her fiancé had broken up with her, and she'd spent years thinking it was her fault for not being ready for commitment. Now, looking at evidence that her mother had sabotaged the relationship, Rebecca started shaking. She destroyed my engagement? She ruined the best relationship I ever had because she wanted to control who I married? Daniel showed her more. The emails about Rebecca's career choices, her friendships, her church involvement that Judith deemed insufficient. Years of her mother undermining her to a network of 50 people who then treated Rebecca according to Judith's narrative. Rebecca left the restaurant in tears, but not before copying everything to her own device. She said she needed time to process, but she believed us. She'd always known something was wrong with their family dynamic, but she'd blamed herself for being too sensitive or ungrateful. 2 days later, Daniel called Noah for a similar conversation. Noah was harder to convince. He'd built his entire identity around being the good son, the one who lived according to their mother's values. Showing him evidence that those values were a cover for systematic abuse threatened everything he believed about himself and his family. He insisted there had to be explanations for the emails, that prayer requests were supposed to share concerns, that their parents had a right to guide their children's spiritual development. Daniel kept pushing, showed him the financial records, proved their parents had lied about needing money while Noah had taken out a second mortgage to loan them $30,000. That got through. Noah couldn't explain away bank statements showing his parents had been financially comfortable while taking his money and claiming poverty. The conversation ended with Noah angry at Daniel for trying to turn him against their mother, but I could see the doubt had been planted. He'd taken copies of the financial documents, said he needed to verify them himself. A week later, Rebecca called Daniel in tears. She'd confronted their mother about the sabotaged engagement, and Judith had admitted it. Not with remorse, but with pride. She'd told Rebecca that the fiancé wasn't spiritually mature enough for their family, and that Rebecca should be thanking her for saving her from a bad marriage. When Rebecca had called her a manipulative liar, Judith had collapsed dramatically and been taken to the emergency room for what she claimed was a heart episode. The doctors had found nothing wrong with her, but she'd stayed in the hospital overnight for observation, posting about her medical crisis on Facebook and garnering hundreds of sympathetic comments about the stress of ungrateful children. Raymond had called Rebecca and demanded she apologize for causing her mother's health emergency. The family was fracturing, and Judith was playing the victim perfectly. But Rebecca wasn't backing down. She'd moved in with a friend and wasn't returning her parents' calls. Noah took longer to crack, but when he did, it was spectacular. He'd spent 2 weeks verifying every financial document we'd shown him, hiring an accountant to review his parents' statements. The accountant confirmed that Raymond and Judith had been lying about their financial situation for years. When Noah confronted his father, Raymond had tried to deflect, saying it was complicated and Noah didn't understand the full picture. So Noah had demanded the full picture, refused to leave his parents' house until they explained why they'd taken $30,000 from him while sitting on nearly $500,000. Judith had tried her usual tactics, crying about disrespect and how dare he question his parents' decisions. But Noah had changed. He'd spent 2 weeks seeing his entire life through a new lens, and he couldn't unsee it. He'd told them he wanted his money back immediately, and when they'd refused, he'd said he was going to tell everyone in the family exactly what they'd been doing. That's when Judith had shown her true face. According to Noah's account, she'd stopped crying instantly and told him that if he breathed a word of their private family finances to anyone, she'd make sure he regretted it. She knew things about his marriage, about his business, about his past that she could share with the right people. It was pure threat, no religious coding, no maternal concern, just cold manipulation. Noah had recorded the whole conversation on his phone. He'd learned something from Daniel's evidence collection. Now he had his mother on tape explicitly threatening him if he revealed her financial lies. The recording was damning. Judith's voice was calm and calculating, nothing like her usual performative emotion. She'd laid out exactly how she'd destroy Noah's reputation, his marriage, and his business relationships if he didn't fall back in line. She'd threatened to tell his wife about an affair she claimed he'd had years ago, an affair that Noah swore had never happened, but that Judith could make look real with the right doctored evidence. Daniel and I met with Rebecca and Noah at Eileen's house, the only neutral territory we had left. The four of us sat in her living room sharing evidence and stories, piecing together the full scope of Judith's manipulation. It was worse than any of us had known individually. She'd been playing each family member against the others, sharing selective information designed to create division and dependence on her as the central authority. Eileen watched us with sad eyes, occasionally filling in context from her years of observation. When we'd finally laid out everything, Daniel asked the question we were all thinking. How do we stop her? How do we break free without her destroying all of us? Rebecca wanted to go public, post everything on social media and expose Judith to her church community. Noah wanted to threaten her back, use the recording as leverage to force her to leave them alone. I'd been thinking about it for days and I had a different idea. We use her own weapon against her. We take it to her church. Everyone turned to look at me and I pulled out another folder I'd been preparing. Judith's power comes from her religious authority. Her church sees her as a pillar of the community, a devoted Christian, a charitable woman. But what if they knew what she'd really been doing? What if we showed them the same evidence you've all seen? Daniel pointed out that her pastor was unlikely to believe us over Judith. She'd been a member of that church for 30 years, taught Sunday school, led prayer groups. We were her ungrateful children trying to smear her reputation. That's when Eileen spoke up. The pastor won't believe you, but the people Judith has hurt might, and there are more of them than you know. Over the next week, Eileen helped us identify other victims of Judith's crusades. Women from the shelter who'd been reported to CPS, former church members who'd been pushed out after disagreeing with Judith on some theological point. Families who'd been targeted by her prayer chain campaigns when they didn't conform to her standards. People who'd borrowed money from Judith and Raymond only to be held hostage by the debt for years. We reached out to 12 people and 9 agreed to meet with us. They all had stories. A single mother who'd sought help from the church shelter only to have Judith report her to CPS after she'd declined to attend a purity-focused Bible study, claiming she didn't feel it was relevant to her situation. Judith had told CPS the woman was using drugs and neglecting her children, forcing an investigation that had found no evidence but had left the woman terrified and traumatized. a young couple who'd attended the church and gotten pregnant before marriage. Judith had led a prayer group that had systematically shamed them, sent letters to their employers suggesting they were morally unfit for their jobs, and pressured them to either marry immediately or give the baby up for adoption. They'd left the church and the state to escape the harassment. A man who'd been part of the church leadership until he'd disagreed with Judith about the church's stance on divorce. She'd started rumors that he was having an affair, shared selective quotes from his emails to make him look morally compromised, and gotten him removed from his position. His marriage had nearly collapsed under the strain before he'd proven the affair was fictional. Each person had documentation, emails from Judith, letters she'd sent, records of her calls to authorities, testimony from witnesses who'd seen her campaigns in action. Together, we had evidence of a pattern spanning 15 years. This wasn't a grieving mother-in-law who'd said one cruel thing. This was a systematic abuser who'd weaponized Christianity to destroy anyone who challenged her control. We compiled everything into a single document, meticulously sourced and organized. Then Daniel requested a meeting with the church's board of elders, not with Pastor Warren, who was Judith's close ally, but with the board members who had oversight over the entire church leadership. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. Daniel, Rebecca, Noah, and I attended, along with Eileen and 3 of the people Judith had harmed most directly. The board consisted of 5 men and 2 women, all longtime church members who'd known Judith for years. Daniel presented our case methodically. He started with the prayer request emails, showing how Judith had used the prayer chain not for genuine spiritual support, but for gossip and manipulation. He showed how she'd systematically undermined her own children's relationships and independence, while claiming to be protecting them spiritually. He played Noah's recording of Judith threatening to destroy his reputation if he revealed the financial lies. Then he turned the floor over to the other victims who shared their stories. The single mother described having her children taken from her for 3 days while CPS investigated Judith's false claims. She talked about the terror of thinking she might lose her kids permanently because she'd refused to participate in a Bible study that had made her uncomfortable. The couple who'd been shamed for their pregnancy outside marriage talked about the letters Judith had sent to their employers, the pressure tactics, the way she'd tried to force them to give up their baby. The man who'd been falsely accused of an affair described losing his leadership position, nearly losing his marriage, and eventually leaving the church entirely to escape Judith's harassment. When everyone had finished, the room was silent. One of the board members, an older man named Gordon, asked why they were bringing this to the board instead of handling it as a family matter. I spoke up for the first time. Because Judith is using this church as a weapon. She's using prayer chains and religious authority to hurt people, and she's doing it in your church's name. Every person here has been damaged by someone claiming to act out of Christian love. That's not a family matter, that's a church accountability matter. The board members exchanged looks. The youngest member, a woman named Lisa, asked if she could see the full documentation. Daniel handed over the binder we'd prepared, hundreds of pages of evidence organized by type and date. The board members passed it around, reading in silence. Finally, Gordon spoke. These are serious allegations. We'll need to investigate thoroughly before taking any action. Rebecca leaned forward. While you investigate, Judith will be in your church every Sunday, teaching Sunday school, leading prayer groups, and targeting new victims. How many more people need to be hurt before you take action? The meeting ended with the board promising to review everything and schedule follow-up conversations. We left feeling like we'd done something, but uncertain if it would be enough. Judith had been protected by the church for so long, we weren't sure if even overwhelming evidence would break through decades of loyalty and institutional inertia. 2 days later, Judith found out about the board meeting. We knew because she called Daniel screaming about betrayal and Judas and how dare he try to destroy his mother's reputation. She'd heard from Pastor Warren, who'd been informed by the board that they were investigating concerns about her conduct. Judith was calling everyone she knew in the church, spinning a narrative about her ungrateful children conspiring against her because she'd tried to save their souls. Her Facebook posts became increasingly unhinged, vague posting about persecution and false witnesses, and how the righteous are always attacked by Satan's servants. She shared Bible verses about honoring your parents and the sins of gossip and slander. Her supporters rallied, flooding her posts with support and condemnation of whoever was causing her such pain. But something was different this time. A few people started asking questions. What specifically had happened? Who was making allegations? Could Judith provide her side of the story with evidence? When Judith responded with more Bible verses and vague references to family drama, some of her usual supporters seemed less convinced. The church board took 2 weeks to complete their investigation. They interviewed everyone we'd identified, reviewed all the documentation, and spoke with other church members who'd witnessed Judith's behavior over the years. What they found was worse than what we'd presented. 6 additional victims came forward once they learned others were speaking up. The board called a special session with Judith and Raymond present. Daniel, Rebecca, and Noah weren't invited, but we heard about it later from Lisa, the board member who'd become our unlikely ally. Judith had arrived dressed for church, her Bible clutched to her chest, ready to perform righteous persecution. The board had presented their findings without accusation or emotion. They'd laid out the pattern of behavior, shown the evidence, asked Judith to respond to specific allegations. According to Lisa, Judith had tried every tactic in her arsenal. She'd cried, claimed persecution, insisted everything was taken out of context. When that didn't work, she'd gotten angry, accused the board of being infiltrated by Satan, threatened to leave the church and take her supporters with her. Raymond had sat silently through most of it until Gordon had asked him directly about the financial lies. Raymond had admitted they'd misrepresented their situation to their children. He'd tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, but the bank statements didn't lie. When pressed about why they'd taken money they didn't need, he'd had no good answer. The meeting had ended with the board informing Judith she was being removed from all leadership positions effective immediately. She could no longer teach Sunday school, lead prayer groups, or serve in any official church capacity. They were also requiring her to attend counseling with a licensed therapist, not just pastoral counseling, and to make restitution to anyone she'd financially defrauded, starting with her own children. Judith had exploded. She'd called them false teachers, claimed they were destroying the church, threatened to expose all their sins if they didn't reconsider. Gordon had told her calmly that threats were exactly why the board had made the right decision. The church needed leaders who operated out of love, not control and manipulation. Judith and Raymond had left the meeting, and Judith had immediately begun calling everyone she knew to share her version of events. She was being persecuted for her faith. She was being attacked for standing up for Christian values. She was being driven out by people who wanted to compromise God's truth. But this time, the board fought back. They sent a letter to the entire congregation explaining that a longtime member had been removed from leadership after credible allegations of harassment and abuse of spiritual authority. They didn't name Judith directly, but everyone knew. More importantly, they outlined new policies for accountability and oversight of church leaders. No more unchecked power. No more allowing people to use church resources for personal vendettas. The response from the congregation was mixed. About half of Judith's supporters left the church with her, believing she was being unjustly persecuted. The other half stayed, some because they'd never fully bought Judith's act, and were relieved someone had finally held her accountable. A surprising number of people approached Daniel and his siblings to thank them for coming forward, sharing their own stories of being hurt by Judith over the years. The church we'd exposed Judith's behavior to wasn't the end of the fallout. Raymond's business started hemorrhaging clients after word spread about the financial fraud against his own children. Noah had told other business owners what his parents had done, and the business community in their small town took family integrity seriously. 3 major clients terminated their contracts within a month. Raymond called Daniel begging him to tell people it was all a misunderstanding. Daniel asked if his father was prepared to return the money they'd taken from their children under false pretenses. Raymond said they couldn't. They'd already spent most of it on renovations to their house and a vacation property. He actually expected his children to just forgive the theft and move on. When Daniel refused, Raymond sent him a letter formally disowning him and declaring he was no longer considered part of the family. The letter was CC'd to Rebecca and Noah, who'd also refused to pretend the financial fraud hadn't happened. Judith tried to weaponize the disownment, posting on Facebook about the pain of children who abandoned their parents. But the post backfired. People who knew what had actually happened called her out in the comments. Someone shared the church board's letter. Within hours, Judith's post had become a thread of people sharing their own experiences with her manipulation and abuse. Rebecca took a screenshot of the whole thread before Judith deleted it and blocked everyone who'd commented. The public exposure was the last straw. Judith shut down her Facebook account entirely, claiming social media had become too toxic and ungodly. Without her online platform, her reach was significantly diminished. She couldn't control narratives or gather sympathy from hundreds of people anymore. She was limited to phone calls and in-person conversations, and many of her old supporters had stopped taking her calls. The financial pressure on Raymond's business continued to mount. He was forced to lay off employees and eventually sell off major assets to stay afloat. The $400,000 they'd hidden while crying poverty began disappearing into business bailouts and legal fees from clients who sued over contract disputes. Within 6 months, Raymond and Judith's financial situation was genuinely precarious, not the fake crisis they'd manufactured before. Daniel struggled with guilt watching his parents' world collapse. I reminded him that they'd brought this on themselves through decades of lies and manipulation. He hadn't destroyed their business. Raymond's reputation had been destroyed by his own choices. Judith's isolation was the result of her own cruelty being exposed. Natural consequences weren't cruelty, they were justice. 3 months after the church board meeting, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was Daniel Whitmore's wife. I confirmed I was, and she introduced herself as Margaret Bellamy, a journalist for the state's largest newspaper. She'd heard about our situation through a friend who attended the church and was interested in doing a story about spiritual abuse in evangelical communities. My first instinct was to say no. We'd been through enough public exposure. But Margaret explained that she wasn't interested in a sensationalistic takedown. She wanted to explore the systemic issues that allowed people like Judith to operate unchecked for years, hurting victims who had no recourse because their abuser was protected by religious authority. I talked to Daniel, and we agreed to meet with Margaret on the condition that we could review anything before publication. She agreed and spent 2 weeks interviewing us, other victims, and even some of Judith's former supporters who'd realized they'd been manipulated. The article was published on a Sunday morning, and it was devastating in its thorough documentation. Margaret had fact-checked every claim, reached out to Judith for comment, and presented a clear picture of how spiritual abuse operates in religious communities. She'd connected our story to broader patterns, interviewing psychologists who specialized in religious trauma and legal experts on the limitations of addressing abuse that happens under the guise of religious practice. Judith's name appeared throughout, along with specific incidents and the impact on victims. The article went viral. Within days, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times, picked up by national news outlets, and sparked conversations in evangelical communities about accountability and abuse. Judith's church issued a formal statement supporting the article's findings and reiterating their commitment to protecting vulnerable members. Other churches began implementing similar oversight policies. Judith tried to respond, starting a blog where she positioned herself as a martyr being persecuted for her faith. But her audience was tiny compared to the reach of the article, and most comments on her blog posts were from people calling out her manipulation and sharing their own stories of being hurt by her. She eventually made the blog private, then shut it down entirely. The article's impact reached further than we'd expected. 2 other families in different states reached out to say they'd recognized similar patterns in their own churches and were now pursuing accountability for leaders who'd abused their authority. A regional network of evangelical churches began developing training on recognizing and preventing spiritual abuse. Our private nightmare had become a catalyst for broader change, but the personal toll was heavy. Daniel's relationship with his parents was completely severed. Raymond had sent one final letter saying they'd raised him better than this and were ashamed of what he'd become. Judith sent nothing directly, but we heard through Rebecca that she told everyone who'd listen that Daniel was dead to her, just another casualty of the secular world's corruption. Rebecca struggled with her own guilt and grief. She'd lost her parents, even though they'd been the ones who'd pushed her away. She started therapy to work through decades of manipulation and the complex feelings of loving people who'd hurt her so badly. Noah had the hardest time. He'd built his entire adult identity around being the good son, and losing that role left him adrift. His marriage nearly collapsed when his wife admitted she'd always known his relationship with his mother was unhealthy but hadn't known how to tell him. They went to couples counseling and slowly rebuilt their marriage on more honest foundations, but it was painful work. As for me, I was still processing the miscarriage that had started this whole chain of events. Losing a baby at 14 weeks leaves both physical and emotional scars that don't heal quickly, but I wasn't processing it alone anymore. I'd found a support group for pregnancy loss, and sharing my story there, including what Judith had said, had helped other women recognize their own experiences with people who'd weaponized their grief. One woman told me that hearing about Judith had finally given her permission to cut off her own mother, who'd told her that her stillbirth was punishment for having premarital sex years earlier. Another woman said it helped her recognize that her church's teaching about suffering being God's discipline was abusive, and she'd left to find a healthier spiritual community. My pain had been used by Judith to hurt me, but in exposing that cruelty, it had somehow helped others escape similar abuse. 6 months after the article was published, Eileen passed away peacefully in her sleep. She'd lived to see Judith's facade finally destroyed, and her grandchildren freed from decades of manipulation. At her funeral, Daniel gave a eulogy thanking her for having the courage to document truth even when it was painful. He said she'd saved their family by being willing to break the silence. Judith and Raymond didn't attend the funeral. Rebecca later told us that Judith had claimed she was too grief-stricken to face the children who'd destroyed her life. In reality, several people who would have been at the funeral had made it clear Judith wasn't welcome after what she'd done. Even in death, Eileen was protecting people from Judith's performance. A year after my miscarriage, I got pregnant again. This time, I didn't tell Judith and Raymond. They didn't know until after our daughter was born healthy at full term. Daniel's sister posted a photo on Facebook, and Judith sent a message through a third party asking for visitation rights. Daniel's response, delivered through our lawyer, was clear. Judith would never have access to our child. She'd forfeited any relationship with our family when she'd used our first baby's death as a weapon. She'd established that she was willing to hurt anyone, including innocent children, to maintain control. We weren't giving her the opportunity to damage another generation. Judith tried to pursue grandparent rights through the courts, claiming she was being discriminated against for her religious beliefs. Her lawyer lasted through one meeting after reviewing the evidence we'd compiled about her pattern of abuse. No lawyer wanted to argue that someone with Judith's documented history of manipulation and cruelty deserved court-ordered access to a grandchild. The petition was withdrawn. 2 years later, Rebecca had a baby, a son she named after Eileen's late husband. Judith found out through Facebook and sent a card with a check for $1,000, as if money could buy back what she'd destroyed. Rebecca returned the check with a note saying that Judith was welcome to have a relationship with her grandson once she'd completed a year of therapy and made genuine amends to everyone she'd hurt. So far, Judith had done neither. Noah and his wife had twins the following year. Noah had sent his parents a brief email with their names and birth weights, but made clear there would be no relationship unless serious changes were made. Judith had responded with a 10-page letter about forgiveness and honoring parents and biblical reconciliation. The letter never once apologized for anything she'd done. It was entirely focused on what her children owed her. Noah had filed the letter without responding. The three siblings had built new traditions for holidays and family gatherings, ones that centered on honesty and healthy boundaries instead of performance and control. We celebrated at each other's homes, invited friends who'd become chosen family, and created space for our children to grow up without the toxicity that had defined Daniel's childhood. It wasn't the family Daniel had grown up expecting, but it was healthier. The church where Judith had held so much power continued its reforms. They'd brought in outside consultants to assess their leadership structure and accountability systems. Several longtime members who'd enabled Judith's behavior had quietly left, unwilling to adjust to the new expectations of transparency and mutual respect. The church was smaller but healthier, and new members often commented on how welcoming it felt compared to other evangelical churches they'd attended. Pastor Warren, who'd been Judith's closest ally, resigned after the board raised concerns about his failure to address multiple complaints about her behavior over the years. He'd known about at least some of what she was doing and had dismissed it as personality conflicts or people being too sensitive. His resignation was framed as retirement, but everyone knew he'd been forced out. The new pastor, a woman named Dr. Simmons, made accountability and compassion her central themes. As for Judith and Raymond, we heard occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. Their house had been sold to cover business debts. They'd moved to a smaller place in a different town where no one knew their history. Raymond had taken a job working for someone else's company after his own business collapsed. Judith had tried to join a new church, but had been quietly asked to leave after the pastor had received calls from our church warning about her history. They'd become essentially what they'd always claimed to be: struggling, isolated, victims of circumstances beyond their control. Except the circumstances were their own choices, and the isolation was the natural result of burning every bridge through decades of manipulation. I thought I'd feel satisfaction watching their downfall. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Destroying Judith's power had been necessary to protect ourselves and prevent her from hurting others. But there was no joy in watching two elderly people lose everything, even when they'd brought it on themselves through cruelty and lies. Daniel struggled with similar feelings. He'd mourned his parents while they were still alive, grieving the relationship he'd thought he had before learning who they really were. Sometimes he wondered if we'd gone too far, if there had been a way to handle it privately without the public exposure and complete family fracture. I reminded him that we'd tried private conversations first. We'd tried boundaries and limited contact. Judith had escalated every single time, using our attempts at peacekeeping as evidence of weakness to exploit further. The public accountability had been a last resort after every private option had failed. And it had worked. Not just for us, but for the other victims who'd finally gotten justice, and for the potential victims who'd been protected from becoming Judith's next targets. 3 years after the miscarriage that had sparked everything, I sat in a church pew during a baptism service for our daughter. It was a different church than the one Judith had dominated, a community we'd carefully vetted for healthy leadership and genuine compassion. As the pastor blessed our daughter, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. I'd lost a baby, been told it was divine punishment, and discovered that my mother-in-law was a systematic abuser who'd been destroying people for decades under the guise of Christian devotion. I'd helped expose her, watched her world collapse, and participated in the fracturing of an entire family. And somehow, through all of that pain and chaos, we'd built something better. A family based on truth instead of performance. A faith community based on love instead of control. A life where our children would grow up knowing they were valued for who they were, not for how well they conformed to someone else's expectations. The baptism ended with the congregation welcoming our daughter into the community. Looking around at the faces of people who'd walked with us through the hardest years, I realized this was what church was supposed to be. Not a weapon to control and manipulate, but a community of broken people trying to love each other well. Judith had tried to use my baby's death to break me and destroy my marriage. Instead, she'd accidentally given me the clarity to finally stop her reign of terror and build something genuine from the ruins. That wasn't forgiveness, exactly. I'd probably never fully forgive the cruelty of using my miscarriage as ammunition in her religious crusade, but it was peace. Understanding that the best revenge wasn't destroying Judith, she'd done that to herself. The best revenge was building a life she couldn't touch, raising children she'd never manipulate, and helping other victims find the courage to break free from similar abuse. 5 years later, we received word that Raymond had passed away from a heart attack. The funeral was small, mostly attended by business associates who didn't know the family history. Daniel and his siblings discussed whether to attend and decided against it. They'd said their goodbyes years ago when they'd accepted that their father had chosen enabling Judith over protecting his children. Sending flowers felt like enough. Judith sent Daniel a message through the funeral home saying Raymond's death was another consequence of his children's cruelty, that the stress of being cut off from family had contributed to his heart condition. Even in grief, she couldn't accept responsibility for the choices that had led to her isolation. We didn't respond. A year after Raymond's death, we heard Judith had moved in with a niece in another state. The niece called Rebecca to explain that Judith had nowhere else to go and she felt obligated to help, but could Rebecca please warn her about what to watch out for? Rebecca had spent an hour on the phone sharing Judith's patterns and tactics, helping her niece establish boundaries before Judith could gain a foothold. The niece had thanked her and promised to be vigilant. The fact that even Judith's extended family now needed warnings about her behavior felt like a fitting epilogue to her story. Our daughter started kindergarten, and on her first day, the teacher asked each child to share something about their family. Our daughter said, "My mommy and daddy chose to have a small family because they only want people who are nice to each other." Out of the mouths of babes came the simplest truth about what we'd built from the ashes of Judith's destruction. We'd chosen to have a small family. We'd chosen people who were nice to each other. And in making those choices, we'd finally broken the cycle of abuse that had defined Daniel's family for generations. That was the real victory. Not the church board meeting or the newspaper article or watching Judith's world crumble. The real victory was watching our kids grow up in a home where love wasn't conditional on obedience, where mistakes weren't divine punishment, and where family meant support instead of control. Judith had called my miscarriage God's punishment for marrying her son. But looking at the family we'd built, the community we'd found, and the peace we'd finally achieved, it was clear that the only punishment had been her own choices destroying the relationships she'd claimed were most important to her. We'd survived, healed, and thrived. She'd burned her life down trying to control ours and was left with ashes. Sometimes justice isn't revenge. Sometimes it's just letting people face the natural consequences of their cruelty while you build something better in the space they can't reach anymore. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.